Every ancient civilization we describe as primitive understood the calendar better than we do. The Maya, the Egyptians, the Druids of pre-Roman Britain, the Lakota, the Yoruba. Separated by oceans and millennia, with no documented contact between them, they all arrived at the same system, 13 months, 28 days each. A calendar so mathematically clean and so precisely synchronized with the sky and the human body that modern astronomers still study the Mayan version to understand things our own system cannot easily explain. And then somewhere along the way, we replaced it. Not with something better, with something irregular, chaotic, and named after Roman emperors. The question nobody seems to want to ask is why. The calendars of these ancient cultures looked like this: 13 months, 28 days each, every month identical, every quarter perfectly equal, every year beginning on the same day of the week. Add one transitional day outside the monthly count, a day that dozens of ancient traditions marked as sacred, and you have 365, a complete solar year. 13 multiplied by 28 equals 364, exactly 52 weeks. The mathematics is so clean it takes about 30 seconds to verify. No child needing to memorize a rhyme to figure out how many days are in a given month. No one counting knuckles just to remember whether June has 30 days or 31. We teach children a memorization trick because our calendar is too irregular to be intuitively understood. We replaced a system that required no explanation with one that requires a mnemonic just to navigate. And when a cleaner version was formally proposed, documented, mathematically verified, and brought before an international body for serious consideration, it was quietly buried. The question is, of course, why? Why would any person, or persons, resist a system that is simpler, more honest, and mathematically beyond dispute? That is exactly the right question. And the moment you ask who specifically benefits from the chaos, that is when the true conversation begins. Surprisingly, the conversation has very little to do with timekeeping. Before we get into who benefited and why, it is worth understanding just how precise and how widespread the old system actually was, and how multiple civilizations with no contact, no shared language, and no common trade routes all arrived at the same calendar. The answer is not so mysterious once you look at what the system is actually built from. You already carry the evidence inside your own body. The human menstrual cycle averages 28 days, 13 cycles per solar year. This is not mythology. This is not numerology. This is biology. One of the oldest clocks in nature, older than any civilization, older than any system of governance, older than any king who ever decided how many days belonged in a month. The human body was already synchronized to this rhythm before we had language precise enough to describe it. The moon confirms it. The sidereal lunar cycle, the moon's true orbit measured against the fixed stars, runs 27.3 days. The synodic cycle, the time it takes for the moon to return to the same phase as seen from Earth, is approximately 29.5 days. The 28-day month sits almost exactly between these two measurements. It is the average of the moon's own rhythm. Ancient cultures did not invent this system. They observed it. They recorded what was already there and what is still there to this very day. The Mayan calendar in particular is worth pausing on, because its precision is genuinely difficult to explain through ordinary historical means. The Mayan civilization operated multiple interlocking calendar systems simultaneously. The Tzolk'in sacred calendar of 260 days, the Harb solar calendar of 365 days, and the long count which tracked time across thousands of years with a precision that allowed them to predict eclipses with greater accuracy than any European system that existed before the modern era. The Mayan astronomers tracked the cycle of Venus to within 2 hours over a 500-year span. They did this without telescopes. They did this without modern timekeeping instruments. And the underlying mathematical structure they used, base 20 rather than base 10, with the 13-month rhythm woven through the longer cycles, is a system that contemporary astronomers and mathematicians continue to find more sophisticated than the model the conquering Spanish replaced it with. None of that fits the standard historical narrative of primitive peoples being elevated by the arrival of European science. It fits a different narrative entirely, one in which the people doing the elevating had a great deal less to offer than the people they were elevating away from. The original Roman calendar before Caesar's reforms had 10 months, and left roughly 60 days in winter simply unaccounted for, an arrangement so obviously broken that even Rome eventually acknowledged it needed fixing. Julius Caesar brought in Egyptian astronomers to redesign it, which is quietly remarkable in itself. The civilization we credit with replacing ancient wisdom had to borrow from it just to make their own calendar functional. The chief astronomer Caesar consulted was Sosigenes of Alexandria, who designed what became known as the Julian calendar in 45 BC, 12 months, 365 days, a leap year every 4 years, closer to functional, but the political fingerprints were already on it. July was named for Julius Caesar directly. Then Augustus, his successor, looked at the calendar and noticed that his month, August, had 30 days while Julius had 31. He took a day from February, already the shortest month, to correct that. This was the precise moment in history when time became a political instrument and was no longer governed by the natural world. The Julian calendar was not just adopted in Rome, it was imposed on every territory Rome conquered. The Druids, who maintained the Celtic lunar calendar with a precision that modern researchers are still working to fully document, were targeted directly. Their traditions were criminalized. Their oral knowledge was systematically disrupted. The calendar was not just changed. The people who carried it were removed from their ability to transmit it. The pattern would repeat in 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII replaced the Julian calendar with the Gregorian, removing 10 days from the calendar by papal decree. Entire populations lost days that had legally existed. People went to sleep in October and woke up almost a fortnight later, with every cultural practice, every agricultural rhythm, every religious observance calibrated to the old system suddenly misaligned. There were riots in several countries. The transition was framed not as the political act it was, but as a correction, a modernization, the replacement of superstition with science. This framing appears everywhere in the historical record of calendar transitions. The language is always the same. What came before was primitive, what arrives now is rational, and the people implementing the change appear in most documented cases to have understood neither the full logic of what they were abandoning nor the full implications of what they were adopting, as if the decision had been made at a level they could not access, and their role was only execution. But the egos of 2 Roman emperors needing satisfaction 2,000 years ago does not mean that the 13-month calendar was lost to antiquity and the ancient knowledge evaporated. At a precise and documentable moment in the early 20th century, serious people with serious institutional resources recognized exactly what the Gregorian calendar was, recognized what a more rational alternative would look like, and organized a sustained, internationally coordinated effort to change it. That effort came extraordinarily close to succeeding, and then it ran into the one force that has defeated more rational ideas than any counterargument ever has: bureaucracy. The kind of bureaucracy that tends to materialize when powerful men have something to lose. Moses B. Cotsworth was a British statistician. In 1902, he published a meticulous technical analysis of calendar reform and proposed what he called the International Fixed Calendar, 13 months of 28 days each, every month identical, every quarter perfectly equal. A 13th month placed between June and July, which he named Sul, positioned at the height of the solar year. One additional day outside the monthly count to complete the 365. The proposal was mathematically unassailable. Its opponents never argued it was incorrect. They could not. They argued instead about tradition, about disruption, about the difficulty of transition. None of those arguments addressed the fundamental question of whether the existing system was actually working. George Eastman found the proposal convincing enough to act on it. The founder of Kodak, one of the most influential industrialists of the 20th century, adopted the International Fixed Calendar for his company internally in 1928 and used it for 61 years until 1989. He did not do this as an experiment. He did it because it worked. Productivity improved, accounting simplified, quarterly comparisons became honest. Eastman then became one of the most vocal public advocates for global reform. He testified, he lobbied, he funded campaigns, and he was not alone. The League of Nations took up the question through its Special Committee of Inquiry on the Reform of the Calendar, formed in 1923. The committee operated for over a decade and received hundreds of proposals from governments, businesses, and religious institutions around the world. The International Fixed Calendar was among the frontrunners. A rival proposal called the World Calendar, designed by Elizabeth Aeschylus in 1930, gained equal momentum. The League of Nations endorsed the World Calendar in 1937. The United Nations later inherited the question after the Second World War. The momentum was real, but by the mid-1950s the conversation had effectively ended. The committees dissolved. The proposals were shelved. The Gregorian calendar remained. The official explanation was religious objection, a single intercalary day disrupting the continuity of the 7-day week, an argument that conveniently ignored the fact that far more disruptive calendar transitions had been absorbed by the same faith centuries before. It was a precise enough objection to sound principled, and a convenient enough one to require no further examination. Principle rarely explains why opposition to a rational idea is so persistent, so coordinated. For that, you have to follow a different thread entirely, and that thread leads, as it so often does, to money. Irregular months create irregular accounting. Irregular accounting requires intermediaries, accountants, administrators, financial clerks, entire professional ecosystems whose existence depends on the complexity of calendar mathematics. Irregular quarters make honest performance comparison nearly impossible. A month in one quarter contains 31 days. The equivalent month in the same quarter of another year may have 28. Comparing performance across those periods cleanly requires adjustment factors, conversion tables, and professional interpretation. What that means in practice is that financial complexity increases, institutional dependency increases, and the ordinary person's ability to independently track their own economic life in relation to the calendar becomes just difficult enough to require help. The longer you sit with the economic history of early 20th century finance, the harder it becomes to believe that the resistance to calendar reform was ever really about a calendar. The largest banks, the largest accounting firms, and the largest international trade organizations all had quiet but consistent positions against reform during the League of Nations debates. None of them argued the mathematics was wrong. They argued instead that the transition would be too costly to manage. A transition that would have permanently simplified their own work was framed as an unmanageable disruption. George Eastman's company quietly abandoned the International Fixed Calendar in 1989. No press release, no official explanation, just a transition back to the Gregorian system. 61 years of demonstrated internal success quietly set aside. The League of Nations archive on calendar reform contains significant gaps. Correspondence is missing from the years of peak lobbying. Meeting minutes summarize discussions without recording their content. The Cotsworth papers at the University of Toronto show gaps that cluster, on inspection, around the most consequential moments of the debate. Not water damage, not cataloguing error. Gaps where the record should be thickest and is not. The World Calendar Association still exists. The 13-moon calendar movement, drawing in part on the research of José Argüelles, continues to argue for a return to the 28-day cycle. These movements are small. They are not funded by major institutions. They are not taught in schools. The mathematics they rely on is not disputed. The historical record they cite is not fabricated. They simply exist at the margins of public discourse, which is exactly where you would expect them to be if the system they are challenging had been designed to sustain itself against challenge. I cannot help wondering sometimes what it would feel like to know where you are in the year the way you know hunger. Not to calculate it, not to consult a device, to feel it, bodily, the way animals sense the season turning before a single leaf has fallen. There are communities that maintained the 28-day count into the modern era. The Hopi of the American Southwest preserved a lunar agricultural calendar into the 20th century, with ceremonial cycles timed to the moon rather than to any imposed civil calendar. The Maori of New Zealand maintained the Maramataka, a lunar calendar of 13 months, well past colonial contact, and the practice has been actively revived in recent decades. Various West African traditions retained 13-month structures alongside imposed Gregorian systems for generations. The Baha'i calendar, established in the mid-19th century, is built on 19 months of 19 days, but uses the same underlying principle, a calendar of identical units that does not require a mnemonic to navigate. Ethnographers who spent time among communities that retained the older systems noted something difficult to quantify but consistent in the reporting, a different relationship to time itself, not passive, not disoriented, present. as if time was something you inhabited rather than something that tracked you. Bronislaw Malinowski, who documented Shrubbery and Islander timekeeping in the early 20th century, described a system in which the calendar was inseparable from the agricultural and ceremonial rhythms of daily life. The calendar was not consulted. It was lived inside. The members of the community knew where they were in the year the way a Western adult knows where they are in the day, instinctively, bodily, without reference to an instrument. That capacity for embodied time sense, ethnographers observed, tends to atrophy in populations that have adopted the Gregorian system. The longer a population has been on it, the less able the members of that population are to track the year without external aids. Whether that is a loss of skill or a consequence of cultural displacement is a question that ethnographers have generally declined to take a firm position on. The Maya built a calendar precise enough that modern astronomers still study it. The Egyptians built one elegant enough that its basic structure survived 3,000 years of political upheaval. The Druids maintained one sophisticated enough to align massive stone monuments to within fractions of a degree. And Moses Cotsworth built one functional enough that a multinational corporation used it profitably for 61 years before being asked, quietly and without explanation, to stop. The mathematics has not changed. The moon still cycles in 28 days. The body still follows the same rhythm it always has. The only difference is that we are now living inside a system that was not designed for us. It was designed around us. But whose system is it exactly?